Alright, so today I'm going to try to give a little bit more breakdown about the chapter we're reading from Frantz Fanon on violence from Wretch of the Earth and how that connects to the film that you all watched on Wednesday, The Battle of Algiers. So I know I wrote some intro for when you guys first started reading the chapter, and I had you read that little piece on the film. But I'll just try to give a little bit of background to tie all these pieces together. I'm really sad that we're not in person for this last section of the course, because I do like to watch films together as a class and then break it down, especially when I think this film is like dealing with a lot of difficult things, and it's also kind of an artistic film and you may not be catching everything because this is your first time seeing it, and I've seen it a dozen times. So I do really regret that we're not together, but hopefully this video will help you as you're working on interpreting and figuring out what's going on. So, okay. So maybe I'll just rehash a little bit of Fanon's biography and his relationship to the Algerian Revolution. So, we have to remember, Fanon is from Martinique. That is a Caribbean island, and it was a colony of France. He fought in World War II, with the French, which when you're a colony, that means you were part of that country, so he fights with the French military. As many people, or I'll say many African descended people experienced after World War II, there's a big breakdown between how Western countries would treat you in terms of joining the military to fight a war, and then when you get home. So this is, famously what sparks the civil rights movement in the United States after a bunch of African Americans come back from fighting, and then they're living in Jim Crow United States. So what does it mean that I can fight and die for my country, and I'm treated so much better here, and then I come home and I'm treated like crap? So similar experience Fanon had after getting back from World War II to Martinique, after Martinique had been basically run by fascists because Hitler took part of France, as we talked with Sartre. So of course Sartre and Fanon are in the same moment together, Sartre being in France and being French, and then Fanon being a colonial subject in Martinique, who then, after coming back, after fighting the military, there's not that many options for him in Martinique. There's not really schools there for him to study at in terms of doing psychiatry, which is his chosen profession. So he has to go to France to get a PhD in psychiatry to become a psychiatrist. So he goes to France, gets his degree, but he doesn't want to stay in France. Why? Because you could actually read his first book, Black Skins, White Masks, where he talks about basically the horrifying experience of being a colonial subject or a black man in France, dealing with that everyday racism. So he didn't want to stay in France and do psychiatry there, but rather he wanted to study the effects of colonization psychologically and politically. And so at that moment, when he graduates, there's a lot of unrest in Algeria, and there, the national liberation struggle is starting. So he goes to Algeria to study that situation psychologically, the French colonizers, and then the native Algerians, and how that interaction shapes their psychology. So that's kind of like his relation to all that. So in relationship to Sartre, Fanon is an existentialist, and you'll see existential themes in his book, but maybe your question, or like something that came up when we were talking about Kant and Sartre, is, well, how do you live a good life, or how are you going to be free if human nature is freedom? And every single person we've read since the midterm has said this, that human nature is freedom, that humans are inherently free. Well, what does that mean if you're living in an unfree world? How do you enact being a human being if your world is fundamentally dehumanizing, and you're an oppressed person, you're a colonized person, you're a racialized person in a white supremacist society? How can you be free? How can you live your truth as a human being? So that's a contradiction. So that's something that maybe has kind of like bubbled on the surface as you read, and then Fanon is really going to dig into that. So he takes up that existentialist framework of freedom and inventing oneself um, and recognizing racism as a function of bad faith, in a sense, of cutting off possibilities, cutting off the ability for human beings to be fully human. Um, so, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So that's what Fanon's going to really look at. He's going to look at, okay, so I recognize the nature of humanity is freedom, and that we know that, like Rousseau said, one cannot live in unfreedom forever. And when we think of one, we can think not only of the individual, but a collective, but a community will not live in unfreedom forever, because naturally people resist oppression. That's just a natural reaction. It's kind of like someone pokes you and you say, ouch, right? So if you are living in oppressive conditions, it can't last forever because people fight back. People resist. People will try to make a new world. So Fanon's going to explore the process of decolonization in the context of here Algeria, which is in northern Africa. So the context of Algeria is that there's a minority of French settler colonists who, while the French were there 130 years in occupation, they were not a majority. You know, they were a small settler colony that ran Algeria. So in the film, you see that there's the European sector. So Algiers, the Battle of Algiers, the name of the film, Algiers is the capital of Algeria. So that film is only looking at the capital city and how the struggle jumped off in the capital city. So as you see, the city is bifurcated. There's the European section, which is super clean and nice, cafes, kids playing in the street, and then you see the Kasbah, or the Arab section, where the native Algerians live. And so these are two separate sectors, though of course the European sector relies on the labor of Algerian people, so they have to travel for work back between these two places. So we're dealing with a situation where a majority of a country is being oppressed by a minority. We can basically, all of the settler colonies in Africa had the same structure. We can also talk about South Africa. So the British and the Dutch Afrikaneers were a tiny minority oppressing the indigenous Azanians, which is the indigenous name for South Africa. So that's similar structure, which is why sometimes this book, Wretched of the Earth, gets called the Bible of decolonization in terms of that issue of when you have a majority that's an indigenous population, you have a minority European settler colonial people, and so then the decolonial process is fighting that minority and regaining control with the indigenous of that place. Okay, but as Fanon tells us, this isn't going to be an inherently violent action. And so already, like, I saw some people commenting in the discussion board about maybe not feeling comfortable with violence, and maybe, all violence is bad, and like maybe as you were watching the film, you're like, oh, well, maybe like the French military is good and the police are doing good things because they want to like stop people from doing violence, right? And so I try to comment back on one of the posts to say that the point of this chapter from Fanon is to psychologically, philosophically, politically study violence. So what Fanon is trying to do is show that there are different kinds of violence, different reasons for violence, and different outcomes from violence. And so for him, and this is why I think The Battle of Algiers is, such a great film, is it shows these different perspectives on violence in the colonial situation. So, but at the same time, while Fanon says it's inherently violent, why is it inherently violent? I mean, this goes all the way back to Rousseau. He's talking about what does it look like if you rule by force. To rule by force is violent. Why? Because if people are inherently free and I'm unfree because you're oppressing me, that's a violent situation. How do I take back my freedom? Well, if you are forcing me to do something, you're not just gonna stop, but I'm gonna have to fight you for it, right? And so there's a sense in which whenever there's conditions of rule by force, you're gonna have eruptions of violence, because that just doesn't, when there's not consent to the way that the world is governed, or there's not consent with the way things are organized, people are gonna be upset. So this is why Fanon says decolonization is violent. Why? Because colonization, conquest, is definitionally not consensual, not about freedom, but it's literally taking someone's land, property, taking their freedom, making them work for you. Like, that is the definition of exploitation, conquest, slavery. So colonization is violent. So to fight it, one needs violence, right? Because the French aren't just going to leave, because as you see, they have all these nice, mansions, and they get to have their cool, like, summer house, in the exotic Africa. They're not going to just leave, because they see it as their own. And the fact that France was there for 130 years, you're like, well, I have, like, 3 generations of my family has my, summer home in Algiers. So this is mine. So this is why there's a confrontation. And one of my favorite scenes in the film is with Colonel Matthew when he's being interviewed by the reporters. And here we see the media starts to question France's occupation in Algeria and starts questioning the tactics of the military. And Colonel Matthew is very clear. He says, what this issue has at base is France wants to stay in Algeria, and Algerians don't want us to stay here. If you think that Algeria should still be French, then you must consent to all of my methods. And so he's showing sort of the bad faith of the French public that would not admit what they're really saying. So if you want to just say, oh, well, we shouldn't torture them, we shouldn't throw them in jail, everyone should have a due process of trial, but you won't address why are these outbursts happening? Well, because you're occupying someone's country and land and taking away their culture, language, and religious practices. So if you're not going to address that, then you're going to have these outbursts. And so Colonel Matthew, in some sense, is one of my favorite characters, because he's authentically himself. And maybe we disagree, but he understands the situation totally. And he's like, look, this is the issue. We want a French Algeria, and they don't. So if you want a French Algeria, then this is what we must do to keep it. And I just think that really clarifies this Manichaean world of the colonizer versus the colonized. These cannot merge. Why? Because it's definitionally structured as the opposition. So to be French is to not be Algerian. Even the idea when French Algeria, what is that? It means that we've taken over. We're making French the national language. We teach, Christianity, not Islam. Like it's this total colonization of everything that it means to live in that space. And that's what the people are fighting against. And the great thing that the film does is shows all of these different tactics and modes of struggle. So first, we see sort of the development of the FLN, which is it's an acronym in the French, which is like the front. I'm not going to butcher French, but it's basically the National Liberation Front of Algeria. And so, National Liberation Struggle, what it means to liberate the nation of Algeria from the rule of France for independence. And we see them developing, like a small group of people that are really just trying to get weapons to try to have some type of military or some type of militia to fight back. Because clearly, as you can see, the wild poverty of the indigenous Algerians at this point, like they don't have, anything to fight back. So what can you do if you just have a knife and they have machine guns? So the people that sort of are the militants realize, okay, we have to get weapons. This is why we first see in the film they target French police officers in order to steal their weapons so they can start building up reserves. And then we see this scene where the French police is upset because they can't deal with these acts of violence within civil procedures, right? So with all the laws that France makes that make sense in France, which isn't a settler colony, so you're not dealing with the same kind of violence, it doesn't make sense in the colony. Because to keep civil society in the European sector requires a lot of violence to hold the native population down, which is not the same in mainland France. It's not the same situation. So this is why the police officers have to take into their own hands to try to deal with the situation. That's when they go and they just indiscriminately bomb the Casbah. Now this, of course, provokes everyone even more, and then there's this big riot, but then actually the FLN's like, let's not riot because we're just gonna get massacred in the street. We're gonna do guerrilla tactics and do, the sneaky thing with like the bombs in the handbags, and we're gonna fight back tit for tat. And so then there's that moment of the struggle where it's tit for tat, indiscriminate violence. Horrible, terrible. Clearly that tit for tat violent situation is not going to sustain a movement, right? But what it does do is like make people awake to that there's a really bad situation happening. So then the next moment of the struggle is the general strike. And so the general strike then, the FLN is like, look, we're done with violence. We're having a ceasefire. And we're going to mobilize all of the Algerians in Algiers to refuse to work for a week. And to really understand this in our situation, I feel like is hard. But maybe it's not actually with like the coronavirus stuff. Like if you live, and these are people, it's not just that you live paycheck to paycheck, like we live like 2 weeks to 2 weeks or 1 week to 1 week. The Algerians, for the most part, were living like day to day, like they were actual day laborers. So that means if you don't work that day, then you don't have money to eat that day. So the FLN, it's a big ask to be like, let's have a general strike for an entire week and you need to like store up reserves for that. But why did they do that? Because A, that's a non-violent tactic that can be done by everybody and that is gonna really highlight the contradictions. One, it's gonna highlight that the European sector only runs on the Algerians' labor. Two, it's gonna bring out whatever violence then the French do to them is like wholly unprovoked, right? Like we're just refusing to work, and then you're bringing your military to force us to work. That also will harken back to the idea of work camps and the Nazis, which is what France just, won the moral victory in terms of beating the Nazis, and then now you're gonna force us into work camps to work for your French settlers in Algeria. So that's a contradiction. So the general strike brings out all these contradictions. But the other thing it does is it shows the people, the majority of the people in Algeria, we are strong when we act together. And we're like, we have an agency and a collective self. We don't need these foreign people to be ruling us. So it's also showing them their humanity. And so that's the moment where Colonel Matthew doesn't, like that tactic. Well, why? Because now it's making the struggle for independence not just 5 crazy people bombing, but it's making it a mass struggle. And so that's going to be harder to contain. And so then we see the French military, they go in their process of like nailing down the pyramid of the organizers. They basically defeat it, right? And like the bombing of Ali's house is supposed to signify absolute destruction of the movement. It's over. And they keep saying it's over, give up, we've already won. But then we get at the end of the film where clearly it's not over. And, it's become a mass movement, and a few years later, Algeria wins independence, and France can't keep them. So that arc is basically what Fanon is talking about in the first half of the chapter, all the way until we get to the section on internationalism. And then the very last section of chapter 1, he's talking about what happens after the revolution. So at some point, there's that discussion between Ben and Ali, those two FLN leaders, and Ali is really like the militant revolutionary. He doesn't even really like the general strike, and he just wants to fight, right? And then we get Ben, who's like, this is nothing. We do need that mass movement that transitions from the moment of like tit for tat violence into like a mass political movement. But then it's also the hardest work is going to come after. How do we build a new society? And so that last bit in the chapter on violence is kind of the post-colonial state, or like what are the issues that country is going to have to deal with once they do get independence, in terms of economic freedom and what kinds of issues their leaders are going to run into. This has already gone on very long. So I think that kind of overviews basically the structure of the first chapter on violence, the role of violence, the film, and then for the discussion post, we'll talk about like the conclusion and some stuff in that last section. But if you have any questions, please email me, come to the Zoom session, and I hope all of your guys' semesters are wrapping up well. All right, see you later.